Sometimes the smallest smile can change a destiny that even kings cannot escape. The moon hung low above Blackwood Palace, bathing the ancient stone towers in silver light, while hundreds of lanterns flickered across the sprawling courtyard like scattered stars. Every noble family from the Northern Territories had gathered beneath the glowing banners for the Moon Gala, the most anticipated night of the year, where alliances were whispered into existence. Fortunes quietly shifted, and every ambitious heart hoped to catch the attention of someone powerful. Claire Whitmore moved carefully through the celebration with a polished silver tray balanced gracefully in her hands. At 22 years old, she had learned how to become almost invisible. Her simple charcoal gray servant's dress blended into the shadows behind jeweled gowns and tailored suits worth more than her family's cottage. Her chestnut hair was neatly braided beneath a modest white ribbon, and her pale skin reflected the moonlight with a quiet softness that few ever bothered to notice. That suited everyone just fine, especially her stepmother. "Keep your eyes down," Eleanor Whitmore had warned before they entered the palace. "Smile only when spoken to. Speak only if necessary. And whatever you do, never draw the attention of an alpha. Girls like you are remembered for all the wrong reasons." Claire had simply nodded. There was no point arguing anymore. Years of quiet obedience had taught her that silence often cost less than defending herself. Around her, laughter floated through the marble halls as musicians filled the evening with elegant strings and gentle piano melodies. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, reflecting across polished floors where influential families greeted one another with practiced smiles hiding carefully measured ambitions. Everywhere Claire looked, expensive fabrics sparkled beneath the moonlit windows while conversations revolved around status, inheritance, and the possibility that the Alpha King himself might appear before midnight. Few believed the rumors. Kings rarely attended celebrations in person anymore. Claire concentrated on serving drinks instead of listening. A servant survived by becoming part of the furniture. She stepped gracefully between guests, offering sparkling cider, chilled water, and glasses of deep crimson berry wine, while keeping her shoulders relaxed despite the constant fear of making a mistake. One spill could become a week of humiliation. One misplaced word could cost her family their position inside the noble estate. Yet despite the tension pressing against her heart, Claire noticed something others seemed too busy to see. Near one of the marble columns, a small wolf pup with snowy white fur had wandered into the ballroom through an open garden door. The tiny creature looked frightened, weaving uncertainly between expensive shoes while guests remained completely absorbed in their conversations. Claire's lips softened into the gentlest smile. Before she could take a single step toward the frightened little animal, an older gentleman wearing a navy coat noticed it as well. He bent slowly, retrieved a delicate silver necklace lying beside the pup, and carefully moved the curious little creature away from the crowded dance floor. Relief warmed Claire's heart. Without thinking, she looked toward the kind stranger and offered him a grateful smile. Nothing more than silent appreciation for protecting a helpless animal that no one else had even noticed. It lasted barely a second. But somewhere across the ballroom, another pair of eyes had been watching. A young noblewoman paused in the middle of her conversation, her expression sharpening as she caught the exchange from a distance. She never saw the frightened wolf pup. She never noticed the necklace lying on the polished floor. She saw only a servant smiling warmly at a distinguished gentleman, and within moments her imagination began writing a story far more dangerous than the truth. The music continued. The laughter never stopped. Claire simply lowered her eyes again, believing the brief moment had already passed. She had no idea that a single innocent smile had just set an entire kingdom on a path that could never be undone. Claire returned to her quiet rhythm, believing the evening had settled back into its graceful flow, but the palace had already begun whispering around her in ways she could neither hear nor imagine. Noble guests had mastered the art of passing rumors with nothing more than raised eyebrows, subtle glances, and carefully measured smiles. Within minutes, the harmless exchange had transformed into something entirely different. A servant girl had smiled at a distinguished gentleman. By the time the story crossed the ballroom for the third time, she had supposedly been flirting. By the fifth telling, she had openly pursued a man promised to another family. Claire remained completely unaware as she accepted another silver tray from the head steward, and continued weaving through the crowd with steady hands. The frightened white wolf pup had disappeared safely into the palace gardens, and that alone made her heart feel lighter. She quietly thanked God that someone had cared enough to help the little creature before it had been frightened by the crowd. The older gentleman who had rescued the pup had already blended back into the gathering, speaking politely with several governors from neighboring territories. He never looked toward Claire again because, to him, nothing remarkable had happened. It had simply been a small act of kindness followed by a grateful smile. Unfortunately, kindness was rarely the story people wanted to believe. At the center of the ballroom, Lady Victoria Ashcroft slowly lowered her crystal glass while watching Claire from across the room. Victoria possessed everything society admired. She came from one of the wealthiest alpha families in the Northern Territories, wore a midnight blue gown embroidered with silver thread, and carried herself with effortless confidence. Yet beneath her elegant smile lived an insecurity she carefully hid from everyone. The gentleman Claire had smiled at happened to be her family's favored choice for a future alliance, although no official announcement had ever been made. Logic should have dismissed the moment entirely. Pride refused to allow it. Victoria leaned closer to two friends standing beside her. She spoke quietly enough to appear discreet, but loudly enough for nearby guests to overhear. It is astonishing how quickly some servants forget their place. Her companions followed her gaze toward Claire. One frowned. Another laughed softly behind her fan. Neither questioned the accusation because the ballroom thrived on assumptions more than facts. Claire approached with fresh drinks, just as several conversations fell strangely silent. She noticed the change immediately. Eyes that had ignored her only moments earlier now lingered a little longer. A few smiles disappeared the instant she looked up. Others exchanged knowing expressions before politely turning away. She searched her memory, wondering whether she had spilled something or forgotten an instruction from the steward. Nothing came to mind. Her pulse quickened anyway. Experience had taught her that unexplained silence usually arrived before embarrassment. Eleanor Whitmore appeared beside her so suddenly that Claire nearly dropped the tray. Her stepmother forced a pleasant smile for nearby nobles while speaking through tightly clenched teeth. "What have you done?" Claire blinked in confusion. "I do not understand." Eleanor's fingers tightened around Claire's wrist just enough to make the warning unmistakable without attracting attention. "People are talking about you. They say you have been trying to attract attention tonight." Claire felt the warmth leave her face. "That is not true. I only thanked a gentleman who helped a lost wolf pup." Eleanor did not even glance toward the gardens. Excuses never survive inside these walls. Perception matters more than truth. Remember that. She released Claire's wrist and immediately resumed her polished smile as another noble couple approached. Claire stood frozen for a heartbeat before forcing herself to keep moving. The music still floated through the ballroom, but now every violin note seemed farther away, as though she were listening from beneath deep water. She tried focusing on simple tasks. Refill the glasses. Collect the empty plates. Avoid eye contact. Keep walking. Yet everywhere she turned, conversations seemed to stop for the briefest moment before quietly beginning again after she passed. Even the palace staff exchanged uncertain glances. No one confronted her directly. Somehow that made everything worse. Near the grand staircase, Claire noticed the same silver necklace resting on a marble table. Apparently, the older gentleman had placed it there after retrieving it from the floor, intending for its owner to claim it later. She smiled softly, relieved that it had not been lost forever. Without thinking, she picked it up carefully and handed it to a nearby attendant. "Someone may be looking for this," she said gently. The attendant thanked her and hurried away. Hidden high above the ballroom, behind the carved stone balcony overlooking the celebration, a tall figure dressed in a dark traveling cloak watched the exchange without speaking. His posture remained perfectly still despite the endless movement below. He had witnessed the frightened wolf pup. He had seen the older gentleman return the necklace. He had watched Claire offer nothing more than quiet gratitude before continuing her work. He had also observed every whisper that followed. His silver eyes moved calmly from one face to another, measuring expressions instead of listening to words. Deception always revealed itself first through fear, pride, or envy. The figure rested one gloved hand against the cold stone railing as another servant quietly approached from behind. "Your Majesty," the attendant whispered respectfully. The council is ready whenever you wish to enter the ballroom. The man never took his eyes off Claire. Not yet, he answered calmly. Let them continue showing me who they really are. Claire told herself that if she simply remained unnoticed for the rest of the evening, the whispers would fade as quickly as they had appeared. She carried fresh linens to one serving station, arranged crystal glasses along another, and thanked each guest who handed her an empty plate with the same quiet politeness she had practiced her entire life. Still, the atmosphere around her continued to shift. Conversations paused whenever she passed. Curious eyes followed her movements before quickly looking away. Every smile she received seemed carefully measured, as though people were no longer seeing a servant completing her duties, but a story they had already decided to believe. Eleanor Whitmore noticed it as well. Her polished expression remained perfectly pleasant for every noble who approached, yet beneath that graceful mask Claire could see disappointment hardening into frustration. It was the familiar look that always appeared whenever Claire accidentally attracted attention. The music swelled as another elegant dance began beneath the enormous crystal chandeliers. Couples crossed the marble floor with practiced confidence, while servants circled quietly around the edges of the ballroom. Claire focused entirely on balancing a silver tray filled with sparkling berry wine, determined not to make another mistake. She almost reached the refreshment table when a soft voice called from behind. Claire. She turned and found Lady Victoria Ashcroft smiling warmly enough for nearby guests to admire her kindness. Would you come here for just a moment? Claire hesitated only briefly before stepping closer. Yes, my lady. Victoria tilted her head sympathetically. I heard there has been an unfortunate misunderstanding tonight. I dislike seeing rumors spread without giving someone an opportunity to explain. Claire felt a small wave of relief. Thank you. I truly did nothing improper. I only smiled because a gentleman helped a frightened wolf pup. Victoria nodded thoughtfully, as though considering every word with fairness. Then perhaps you should tell everyone exactly that. The invitation sounded generous, yet something inside Claire suddenly tightened. Before she could answer, Victoria gently raised her voice just enough for nearby conversations to quiet. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe Miss Whitmore wishes to clarify something. Heads turned almost immediately. One conversation ended, then another, until dozens of curious faces slowly shifted toward Claire. The musicians continued playing, but even their melodies seemed softer beneath the growing silence. Claire froze. She had never wanted an audience. Victoria stepped gracefully aside, leaving Claire standing alone in the open space between the ballroom and the dance floor. Go ahead, Victoria encouraged with another flawless smile. We are listening. Claire's pulse raced against her ribs. I only wished to thank the gentleman who protected the little wolf pup. That was all. A few people exchanged puzzled looks. Others frowned. Then someone quietly asked, which gentleman? Claire looked across the ballroom, searching for the older man in the navy coat, but he had already disappeared into another reception hall. She pointed uncertainly toward the area where she had last seen him. I do not know his name. He was standing over there earlier. The hesitation lasted only a second, yet it proved long enough for doubt to spread. A nobleman near the back folded his arms. Convenient. Another woman whispered just loudly enough to be heard. She does not even know who she smiled at. Soft laughter rippled through the gathering. It was not cruel laughter, but something almost worse. It carried the sound of quiet judgment from people convinced they already understood the truth. Claire swallowed hard. No, please. You misunderstand. Victoria sighed gently, almost regretfully. No one wishes to embarrass you, Miss Whitmore. We simply believe servants should remember appropriate boundaries during royal celebrations. Eleanor stepped forward immediately, offering an apologetic bow toward the surrounding guests. My stepdaughter has always been overly innocent. I sincerely apologize if anyone has felt uncomfortable this evening. Claire stared at her in disbelief. She had expected protection. Instead, Eleanor's apology sounded like confirmation. The room seemed to grow smaller around her. Every chandelier suddenly felt brighter. Every whisper sounded louder. She lowered her eyes, wishing only to disappear into the polished marble beneath her feet. At that exact moment, the palace attendant returned carrying the delicate silver necklace Claire had rescued only minutes before. Excuse me, he called politely while walking through the crowd. We found the owner of this necklace thanks to Miss Whitmore's honesty. She made certain it was returned safely. Claire looked up in surprise. The young woman who accepted the necklace smiled gratefully before disappearing into the crowd. For the briefest instant, genuine silence settled across the ballroom. Several nobles exchanged uncertain glances, realizing that Claire's actions reflected kindness rather than manipulation. Victoria's pleasant expression stiffened almost imperceptibly. The story she had carefully guided was beginning to crack. High above the ballroom, hidden behind the carved stone balcony, the cloaked observer watched every expression without missing a single detail. His silver eyes rested on Claire as she quietly lowered her head once more, accepting humiliation she had done nothing to deserve. Around her, people still debated appearances. Only one man had taken the time to watch what had actually happened. The uncomfortable silence lasted only a few seconds before the ballroom slowly came back to life, but the atmosphere had changed in ways Claire could feel without anyone speaking another word. The necklace had been returned to its rightful owner because of her honesty, yet the rumor refused to disappear. It simply changed shape. Instead of openly questioning her intentions, people now watched her with cautious curiosity, as though they were trying to decide whether she was genuinely innocent or simply very convincing. Claire wished she could leave the ballroom altogether, but the Moon Gala had not yet reached its highest ceremony, and every servant was expected to remain at their assigned station until the final royal announcement. She drew a slow breath and reminded herself that the evening would eventually end. Tomorrow, another celebration would replace this one in the minds of the nobility. Rumors always found new victims. She only hoped she would no longer be one of them. Near the Eastern Gallery, the older gentleman in the navy coat finally reappeared after speaking with several visiting officials. Claire recognized him immediately and felt a small sense of relief. If anyone could explain what had truly happened, surely it was him. Before she could even consider approaching, Lady Victoria gracefully intercepted the gentleman with a welcoming smile. Their conversation appeared polite, but several nearby guests subtly drifted closer, pretending to admire the paintings while clearly listening. Victoria lowered her voice just enough to sound respectful. "Lord Benjamin, I hope you will forgive my curiosity. Earlier this evening, one of the servants seemed rather eager to gain your attention. I simply wish to confirm that nothing inappropriate occurred." Lord Benjamin looked genuinely puzzled. "A servant?" Victoria nodded delicately. "Miss Claire Whitmore, the young Omega who smiled at you during the reception." Several guests quietly waited for his answer. Claire stood nearly 30 feet away arranging fresh glasses, unable to hear every word, yet she recognized her own name the instant it was spoken. Her heart tightened. Lord Benjamin searched his memory for several seconds before a warm expression crossed his face. "Oh, the young woman with the kind smile. Yes, I remember her." A few hopeful whispers immediately spread through the gathering, each person eager to hear what came next. Lord Benjamin continued with complete sincerity. "She thanked me after I moved a frightened wolf pup away from the crowd. That was all." She seemed more concerned for the little creature than for anything happening in the ballroom. Victoria's smile remained perfectly composed, although disappointment briefly flickered in her eyes. "So you had no previous acquaintance with her?" "None whatsoever," Benjamin answered pleasantly. "We exchanged no conversation beyond a grateful smile. If more people noticed such small acts of kindness, the world would probably become a gentler place." His answer should have ended every rumor. Instead, silence settled over the nearby guests as many of them quietly avoided looking at Claire. Some appeared embarrassed for having believed the worst so quickly. Others simply looked annoyed that the evening's most entertaining story had dissolved into something ordinary. Claire lowered her eyes once more. She expected someone to apologize. No one did. Victoria offered Benjamin a graceful farewell before turning away with flawless composure, but inside her thoughts raced. Publicly, she could no longer question Claire's behavior. The facts no longer supported the accusation. Yet pride rarely surrendered so easily. She convinced herself that even if Claire had done nothing wrong, servants still needed reminders about their place. Eleanor Whitmore approached her stepdaughter again, though this time her voice carried less anger than nervous exhaustion. "You should be grateful," she whispered. "Things could have become much worse." Claire looked at her quietly. "I never wanted any attention." "I know," Eleanor replied, avoiding her eyes. "Sometimes that is not enough." Before Claire could answer, every lantern inside the ballroom suddenly dimmed. One by one, musicians lowered their instruments until the final violin note disappeared into complete silence. Hundreds of conversations ended at once. The enormous bronze doors at the far end of the palace slowly opened without a sound. Cool night air drifted inside, carrying the scent of pine, cedar, and fresh rain. Every noble instinctively turned toward the entrance. Even the servants stood perfectly still. Claire had never witnessed such immediate silence. It was as though the palace itself had drawn a single collective breath. High above the entrance, hidden behind the balcony where he had patiently watched the entire evening unfold, the cloaked observer finally stepped away from the shadows. His measured footsteps echoed softly across the stone corridor beyond the great doors. The royal attendants straightened simultaneously. Council members lowered their heads without being instructed. Claire could not yet see the man's face, but something deep within her sensed that the evening everyone believed they understood was only now truly beginning. The enormous bronze doors continued opening until moonlight poured across the polished marble floor like a silver river, washing away every whisper that had filled the ballroom only moments before. Claire instinctively stepped backward with the other servants, lowering her eyes as tradition required, yet curiosity quietly tugged at her heart. She had heard stories about the Alpha King since childhood. Some described him as distant. Others called him brilliant. Many insisted that no one could ever predict what he would do because he judged people by actions instead of reputation. Until tonight, those stories had been nothing more than distant legends. The first royal guards entered in perfect silence, their dark uniforms trimmed with silver thread that reflected the lantern light. Behind them walked members of the royal council, each carrying themselves with practiced dignity. Every noble bowed respectfully as they passed. The musicians remained motionless. Even the crackling fireplaces seemed quieter than before. Then the final figure crossed the threshold. King Lucian Blackwood removed the dark traveling cloak that had hidden his identity throughout the evening and handed it calmly to an attendant. Gasps quietly spread through the ballroom. Claire's breath caught. She recognized the broad shoulders immediately. He had been the silent observer on the upper balcony all along. The realization sent a wave of disbelief through her chest. While everyone else had celebrated, speculated, and judged one another, the Alpha King himself had watched everything unfold without revealing who he was. Lucian wore a formal black coat embroidered with subtle silver patterns that resembled moonlit branches stretching across winter trees. His dark hair rested neatly against his collar, and his calm silver eyes moved across the ballroom with remarkable patience rather than pride. He did not rush. He did not seek admiration. Instead, he studied the room with the quiet confidence of someone who had long ago stopped needing to prove his authority. Every person lowered their head as he passed. Victoria Ashcroft performed a flawless curtsy. Eleanor Whitmore bowed deeply. Lord Benjamin respectfully placed one hand over his heart. Claire followed the other servants, lowering her gaze until she could see only the polished marble beneath her shoes. Yet despite her careful posture, she sensed something unusual. The king's footsteps slowed. Not near the council, not beside the governors. Somewhere much closer. She resisted every instinct telling her to look up. Royal etiquette demanded complete respect. Lucian finally stopped walking. The ballroom waited in complete silence. His voice arrived calm and steady, carrying effortlessly across the enormous hall without ever becoming loud. I have spent this evening learning far more than I expected. Several nobles exchanged uncertain glances but remained silent. Lucian continued. Every moon gala celebrates loyalty, honor, compassion, and truth. Those values mean little if they disappear the moment no one believes the king is watching. Claire felt the words settle heavily across the room. They did not sound like a speech prepared for celebration. They sounded like quiet observations from someone who had witnessed everything. Lucian slowly turned toward Lord Benjamin. My lord, earlier this evening, did a servant behave improperly toward you? Benjamin answered without hesitation. Absolutely not, Your Majesty. She simply thanked me after I moved a frightened wolf pup away from the crowd. That was the beginning and the end of our interaction. Lucian nodded once before allowing his eyes to move across the gathered nobles. Then why, he asked gently, did such a simple act become a story of dishonor? No one answered. The silence grew heavier with every passing second. Claire remained perfectly still, scarcely believing what she was hearing. The king was not questioning her. He was questioning everyone else. Victoria lowered her eyes. Eleanor quietly clasped her hands together. Several guests shifted uncomfortably as they remembered the conversations they had eagerly joined less than an hour earlier. Lucian walked slowly through the crowd until he reached the small marble table where the silver necklace had rested before being returned to its owner. He touched the empty surface for only a moment, almost as though recalling the entire sequence exactly as it had happened. "I watched a servant notice a frightened animal before anyone else did," he said. "I watched her express gratitude to the man who helped it. I watched her protect another guest's lost necklace without expecting recognition. Then I watched honest actions transformed into suspicion because kindness was apparently less interesting than gossip." Claire's heart pounded so loudly she wondered whether anyone standing beside her could hear it. She had spent the entire evening wishing someone would simply believe her. She never imagined the one person who had witnessed everything had been the Alpha King himself. Lucian finally lifted his gaze toward the servants gathered along the ballroom wall. His silver eyes settled on Claire with calm certainty, and although he said nothing further, she felt as though he had seen every quiet sacrifice, every silent apology, and every act of kindness she had ever hidden from the world. Around them, the entire ballroom remained frozen, waiting for whatever the Alpha King would do next. No one dared to interrupt the silence that followed the Alpha King's words. The enormous ballroom, which only an hour earlier had echoed with music and effortless laughter, now stood perfectly still beneath the silver glow of the chandeliers. Claire remained with the other servants, her hands folded carefully in front of her, convinced that the king's attention would soon move elsewhere. She had never imagined that someone as powerful as Lucian Blackwood would remember the actions of a servant whose greatest accomplishment had been quietly helping others without expecting anything in return. Lucian looked across the gathering one final time before speaking again. His voice remained calm, yet every word carried unmistakable authority. "I have one question. Who decided that gratitude should become a reason for humiliation?" The question settled over the crowd like fresh snowfall. Nobody answered. Victoria Ashcroft lowered her eyes toward the marble floor. Eleanor Whitmore pressed her lips together, uncertain whether speaking would improve or worsen the situation. Even the members of the royal council remained silent, understanding that the king already knew the answer. Lucian slowly descended the final step separating the royal platform from the guests. His polished shoes echoed softly across the ballroom as he walked with deliberate patience. He was not angry. That somehow made the moment even more powerful. Anger faded quickly. Quiet certainty remained. He stopped only a few feet from Claire. She instinctively bowed her head even farther, unable to bring herself to meet his gaze. "Your name?" he asked gently. "Claire Whitmore, Your Majesty." Her voice barely rose above a whisper, yet the room heard every syllable. Lucian nodded once. "Miss Whitmore, when you thanked Lord Benjamin, what did you hope to gain?" Claire hesitated only because the question seemed impossible. "Nothing, Your Majesty." The little wolf pup looked frightened. "Lord Benjamin helped it. I was simply grateful." Lucian studied her face for a long moment. There was no calculation in her expression, no fear of being discovered in a lie, only quiet honesty mixed with confusion. He turned back toward the assembled nobles. "There is the difference," he said calmly. "Some people perform kindness because they hope someone important will notice. Others perform kindness because no one is watching. Tonight, I discovered which kind deserves my respect." Several council members exchanged thoughtful glances. Lord Benjamin smiled quietly to himself. Eleanor slowly closed her eyes, realizing she had underestimated the young woman she had spent years criticizing. Victoria wished desperately that the evening would simply end. Lucian extended one hand toward a nearby royal attendant. Without a word, the attendant presented a folded ceremonial cloak woven from deep midnight blue fabric trimmed with silver embroidery representing the royal house of Blackwood. It was not a crown. It was not a title. Yet everyone inside the ballroom immediately recognized what it represented. Royal protection. The privilege was rarely granted outside the king's own household. Claire looked up in startled disbelief as Lucian accepted the cloak. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "I do not understand." "You will," he answered with the faintest hint of a smile. He carefully unfolded the cloak and placed it across her shoulders with quiet dignity. The rich fabric settled gently around her simple servant's dress, creating such an extraordinary contrast that several guests gasped aloud. Claire instinctively reached toward the cloak, afraid she might somehow damage something so valuable. Lucian stopped her with a calm gesture. "Leave it where it belongs. It suits you well." Tears shimmered in Claire's eyes, not because of the expensive fabric, but because no one had ever looked at her with such uncomplicated respect. She had spent years trying to avoid becoming a burden to anyone. Tonight, for the first time, someone powerful had stepped forward, not because she demanded help, but because he believed she deserved fairness. Lucian faced the ballroom once again. "Let there be no confusion after tonight. Miss Claire Whitmore acted with honesty, compassion, and integrity from the beginning of this evening until this very moment. Anyone who chooses to question her character is choosing to question my own judgment." A wave of astonishment swept through the hall. No one misunderstood the meaning of those words. The Alpha King had publicly placed his confidence behind an Omega servant. It was an honor few nobles would ever receive. Claire felt the weight of countless eyes upon her once again, yet everything had changed. Those same people who had quietly judged her only an hour earlier now looked at her with stunned respect. Lucian's silver eyes met hers one final time. His expression remained composed, but something gentle rested beneath his steady gaze. "Sometimes, Miss Whitmore, the rarest strength in any kingdom is simply a heart that chooses kindness when no reward is expected. I believe such strength deserves to be protected." Around them, every noble remained silent, for no one could deny that the course of the evening, and perhaps far more than the evening itself, had just changed forever. Claire could still feel the unexpected weight of the royal cloak resting across her shoulders long after the ballroom had fallen silent again. The fabric was warm despite the cool evening air drifting through the open palace doors, and every embroidered silver thread seemed to remind her that this could not possibly be real. Only an hour earlier she had struggled to avoid becoming the center of unwanted attention. Now the Alpha King himself had publicly entrusted her with the protection of his own household. She lowered her eyes, uncertain where to stand or even how to breathe without making another mistake. Lucian noticed the uncertainty immediately. Instead of returning to the royal platform, he remained beside her, allowing the nobles to absorb the moment exactly as it had unfolded. His calm presence carried none of the distance people often expected from a ruler. It felt steady, patient, and impossible to misunderstand. Lord Benjamin quietly stepped forward and offered a respectful bow. "Your Majesty, if I may speak." Lucian nodded. "Please do." Benjamin turned toward the gathering. "I believe there is something everyone here deserves to hear. Earlier this evening, I did not simply see Miss Whitmore smile. I saw why she smiled." Several guests looked toward him with renewed curiosity. Benjamin continued without hesitation. "When the little wolf pup wandered into the ballroom, most of us remained focused on our conversations. Miss Whitmore noticed the frightened animal immediately. Before she even looked at me, she had already taken one step toward helping it herself. I merely happened to reach it first because I was closer." Her smile was never directed toward me as a man. It was gratitude that someone had protected a helpless creature before it became overwhelmed by the crowd. A quiet murmur spread through the ballroom. Claire felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. She had never expected such a small moment to become the subject of an entire evening. Benjamin smiled kindly in her direction. Then she found the necklace that another guest had accidentally dropped and made certain it was returned without asking who owned it or expecting anyone to thank her. "I have attended royal gatherings for more than 20 years. I have learned that character reveals itself most clearly through the smallest decisions, not the grandest speeches." Claire blinked back unexpected tears. Hearing someone describe her actions so honestly felt almost overwhelming because no one had ever bothered to notice those quiet moments before. Lucian folded his hands behind his back as he looked across the assembled families. "This is why I remained unseen tonight. A kingdom cannot be measured only by how its people behave before a throne. It must also be measured by how they treat those they believe have no influence at all." His words settled deeply over the gathering. Several nobles slowly lowered their heads, recognizing themselves in the lesson without being directly accused. Eleanor Whitmore found herself unable to meet Claire's eyes. For years, she had mistaken quietness for weakness and humility for insignificance. Tonight she realized that the young woman standing only a few feet away possessed a dignity no title could create. Lady Victoria Ashcroft stepped forward after several moments of silence. Her elegant posture remained composed, although genuine regret softened her expression for the first time that evening. "Miss Whitmore, I allowed assumptions to speak louder than truth. That was unfair to you. Please accept my apology." Claire looked at her with quiet surprise. She had imagined many endings to the evening, but hearing those words had never been one of them. "You do not owe me anything," Claire answered softly. "I only hope we can remember what truly happened." Victoria nodded slowly. "So do I." Lucian watched the exchange with thoughtful approval. Forgiveness freely offered often required more courage than winning any argument. That simple realization strengthened his respect for Claire even further. Most people defended themselves the moment they gained the upper hand. Claire chose peace instead. As the musicians cautiously resumed a gentle melody, the tension inside the ballroom slowly gave way to something entirely different. Conversations returned, but they carried a new tone. Guests who had overlooked Claire earlier now greeted her with respectful smiles. Servants stood a little taller, knowing that kindness had been seen rather than ignored. Outside the towering palace windows, the full moon climbed higher above the ancient forest, covering the gardens in pale silver light. Lucian followed Claire's gaze toward the quiet grounds where the frightened wolf pup had safely disappeared hours earlier. Without looking away from the moonlit trees, he spoke softly enough that only she could hear. "The first reason I noticed you tonight was because you cared for a creature everyone else overlooked." Claire glanced toward him in surprise. Lucian's silver eyes reflected the moonlight as he continued with quiet certainty. "The second reason was because this was not the first time I had heard your name." Claire's heart skipped. She searched his expression, wondering what he meant, but the Alpha King simply offered the faintest knowing smile before turning back toward the waiting council, leaving one unexpected truth lingering in the cool night air. Somehow, long before this moon gala had ever begun, King Lucian Blackwood had already known exactly who Claire Whitmore was. Claire stood quietly beneath the soft glow of the chandeliers, still trying to understand how one ordinary evening had transformed into something that would be remembered across the kingdom. The royal cloak resting on her shoulders felt heavier now, not because of its fine fabric, but because of everything it represented. Everywhere she looked, the expressions surrounding her had changed. Faces that had once dismissed her with indifference now carried curiosity, respect, and even regret. None of it felt real. She had not become a different person during the last hour. The only difference was that someone powerful had finally chosen to see the truth. King Lucian returned to the center of the ballroom, where the royal council waited beside the ceremonial dais. Instead of ending the evening with another speech, he invited every guest to remain where they stood. His measured voice carried naturally through the hall. Tonight was never meant to test etiquette. It was meant to reveal character. No one interrupted him. Even the musicians allowed the final notes of their melody to fade into silence. Lucian continued, "Titles create influence. Wealth creates comfort. Neither guarantees wisdom. A kingdom remains strong only when ordinary kindness is valued as highly as extraordinary achievement." Those words settled over the gathering more deeply than any formal decree. Several noble families exchanged thoughtful glances, realizing that they had judged someone without taking even a moment to learn the truth. Lady Victoria Ashcroft stepped forward once again. This time there was no performance in her expression. She bowed respectfully toward Claire before addressing the king. "Your Majesty, I allowed assumptions to guide my judgment. That choice encouraged others to do the same. I accept responsibility for my part in what happened." Lucian acknowledged her honesty with a quiet nod. Recognizing a mistake is the first step toward correcting it. He did not humiliate her. He did not embarrass anyone by naming every careless whisper that had spread through the ballroom. Instead, he allowed each person to examine their own conscience. That decision carried far greater weight than public punishment ever could. Eleanor Whitmore slowly approached Claire. Her hands trembled slightly as she stopped in front of her stepdaughter. For several long moments, she searched for words that never seemed adequate. Finally, she whispered, "I spent years believing that staying unnoticed was the safest path for you. Tonight, I realized that I never protected your dignity. I only protected my own fears." Claire looked at the woman who had raised her. She remembered countless quiet evenings, endless criticism, and every reminder that she should remain invisible. Yet she also saw genuine regret. With gentle honesty, she replied, "We cannot change what has already happened. We can choose what happens next." Eleanor lowered her head, deeply moved by the grace she had never expected to receive. Lord Benjamin smiled warmly as he watched the exchange. "Compassion," he said quietly to a nearby council member, "always reveals the strongest heart in the room." Lucian heard those words and found himself silently agreeing. Throughout the evening, he had witnessed nobles competing for admiration, influence, and prestige. Claire alone had acted without expecting recognition. Even after receiving public honor, she sought reconciliation instead of revenge. That confirmed everything he had quietly observed about her long before the moon gala began. As palace attendants reopened the doors leading toward the moonlit gardens, guests slowly resumed their conversations. The tone had completely changed. People no longer whispered about scandal. They spoke about integrity, humility, and the unexpected lesson the evening had delivered. Several servants who had always worked unnoticed received warm smiles from visiting families. Small gestures of appreciation appeared throughout the hall as though kindness itself had become quietly contagious. Claire stepped onto the palace terrace for a brief moment, breathing in the cool scent of pine carried by the evening breeze. The same peaceful moon shone above the gardens where the frightened white wolf pup had wandered hours earlier. Everything outside remained calm, untouched by rumor or pride. Behind her, the palace doors opened softly. She turned to find King Lucian standing a respectful distance away. He looked toward the forest before speaking. Sometimes a kingdom changes because of a great victory. Sometimes it changes because one person refuses to stop being kind. Claire lowered her eyes, humbled by his words. "I only did what felt right." Lucian smiled faintly. "Exactly." For a quiet moment, neither of them spoke. The moonlight reflected across the silver embroidery of the royal cloak, and somewhere beyond the palace walls a young wolf called gently into the night, as though reminding them both that destiny often begins with the smallest acts that no one expects to matter. The palace terrace remained peaceful as the final hours of the moon gala quietly unfolded beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars. Claire stood beside the carved stone railing, the royal cloak resting gently across her shoulders while a cool breeze carried the scent of cedar and fresh rain through the gardens below. For the first time in many years, she did not feel invisible. She simply felt seen. Behind her, the grand ballroom slowly emptied as guests prepared to return to their estates. Yet their conversations were unlike those that had filled the palace only a few hours earlier. No one spoke about scandal anymore. They spoke about humility, fairness, and the unexpected lesson the Alpha King had chosen to teach without humiliating anyone. Rumors had faded, replaced by something far more enduring: respect. King Lucian joined the members of the royal council one final time before turning back toward the gathered nobles. Every conversation ceased the moment he stepped onto the ceremonial platform. Moonlight streamed through the towering windows behind him, surrounding the room with a calm silver glow that reflected from every crystal chandelier. His expression remained composed, yet there was warmth in his voice that had not been there when the evening began. Tonight reminded us that truth is often quieter than rumor, and kindness is often overlooked until someone chooses to recognize it. I will not allow this kingdom to become a place where appearances matter more than character. The council members bowed their heads in agreement. Lucian then looked toward Claire, who remained near the entrance exactly where the servants had stood throughout the celebration. "Miss Claire Whitmore," he said, "please come forward." The request echoed through the ballroom. Claire hesitated for only a heartbeat before walking slowly across the polished marble floor. Every step felt unreal. Earlier that evening, she had crossed the same room, carrying trays of refreshments while hoping no one would notice her. Now hundreds of eyes followed her with genuine respect rather than judgment. She stopped several feet from the Alpha King and bowed her head. Lucian smiled gently. "You entered this palace believing your greatest strength was remaining unseen. I believe your greatest strength has always been your compassion." Claire looked up, surprised by the certainty in his words. "Your Majesty," she answered softly, "I only tried to do what my parents taught me long ago. If someone needs help and I am able to help, then I should." A quiet smile appeared on Lord Benjamin's face. Several members of the royal council exchanged approving glances. Lucian nodded slowly, as though hearing the final piece of an answer he had been searching for. That is exactly why I already knew your name before tonight. A wave of curiosity spread through the room. Claire's eyes widened slightly. Lucian continued, "For nearly a year, I have received reports from villages throughout the Northern Territories. They never mentioned titles or wealth. They spoke of a young Omega who quietly delivered food to elderly neighbors during harsh winters, who comforted frightened children after storms, who returned lost belongings without expecting reward, and who never accepted credit for any of it. Every report described the same person, Claire Whitmore." The ballroom fell silent once again. Eleanor covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. She had known only a small part of what Claire had done beyond the estate. Claire herself looked genuinely embarrassed. "I never wanted recognition," she whispered. Lucian answered with quiet conviction. "That is precisely why recognition found you." He turned toward the assembled guests. "From this night forward, Claire Whitmore will serve as Royal Ambassador of Community Welfare, working directly with the Crown to support villages, families, and children throughout the kingdom. Her voice will always have a place in this palace." A wave of heartfelt applause filled the ballroom. It was not loud or forced. It carried the sincere admiration of people who had witnessed someone earn honor through quiet integrity rather than ambition. Claire felt tears gather in her eyes once more. They were not tears of sadness, but of gratitude for a future she had never imagined possible. Lucian extended his hand, and after a brief, respectful hesitation, Claire accepted it. Together they turned toward the palace entrance where the moon illuminated the ancient gardens stretching beyond the castle walls. The frightened little wolf pup was nowhere to be seen now, yet its brief appearance had quietly changed countless lives. Sometimes destiny did not arrive through grand battles or impossible miracles. Sometimes it began with a single act of kindness, a grateful smile, and one person powerful enough to recognize the truth when everyone else had chosen to look away. As the palace bells softly welcomed the new day, Claire stepped forward with hope instead of fear, while beside her the Alpha King smiled toward the future of a kingdom that had just learned its greatest strength was not power alone, but the courage to honor goodness wherever it was found.